Hey guys, welcome to Ecclesiastes Part 2. Today we will be covering Chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. Before we begin though, I do want to clarify a few things. First of all, this is wisdom literature. This isn't the same thing as something that's entirely prescriptive, where it's saying this is exactly how everything is, no ifs, ands, or buts, no quabbles, everything is completely meaningless no matter what. I'm not quite saying that, but at the same time, I know that there are a lot of people that feel like, oh, he's talking about this from the position of a non-believer. Like, oh, this is what life is like for a non-believer, for someone who doesn't have a relationship with God. No, he's talking about this as someone with a relationship with God, as a believer, as we would call them nowadays. He's not talking about this in a hypothetical way. He's talking about it like, hey, as the wisest guy in all of Israel, I know what I'm talking about, and everything is meaningless. Altogether. The rest of the book is about how each different thing that he lists is meaningless. He's not saying, oh, for the non-believer. He's saying for everyone, including us. He later on quantifies the statement, but he's making the statement for everyone. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the actual passage. So, Ecclesiastes 2:1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. That also provided to be meaningless. Now, this is kind of a defining statement for the rest of the chapter. He's simply saying, I went out to seek pleasure, and that is meaningless. Verse 2. Laughter is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? Saying laughter isn't just meaningless, but it's also insane to chase after laughter. And pleasure does nothing, which then goes on to quantify like exactly what does that mean later on. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me in wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. Starts off by saying, I embraced being foolish. I drank a lot. I embraced foolishness. I kept my mind about me though, which, by the way, to me that kind of seems almost like a statement justifying himself. He's all like, "Oh no, I didn't fall into debauchery because this is Solomon." He's all like, "Oh, I didn't fall into debauchery because of my wives and all that stuff. I I just want to test things out." But anyways, he he then says, "I want to see what was good for people to do in their few days of life." I mean, first of all, life is pretty short in the grand scheme of things. The Earth has been around for thousands of years. Even if you take the youngest Earth version of how old the Earth is, it's still like 5,000 years. We will live a very maximum of 100 years, which we won't live. It's more likely we'll live about 70 years. 70 years is a drop in the bucket compared to a couple thousand years. It's extremely short. We have extremely short lives. But I wanted to see what was good for people to do. I'm trying to figure out what's good. I'm afraid that everything's meaningless. I'm trying to figure out what's good for everything, for everyone to do. It says in verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I built things. I did, because something that's common, especially back then, but even now, is land ownership and like building. Hey, I built myself a house. It's going to be worth a lot, which means that I am worth a lot. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I gardened. I went out and made the stuff that will be there even after I'm dead, hopefully. This long-lasting vineyard. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Continuing on with that idea of like, oh, I'm making this stuff from Mother Earth for the nature. And then I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves that were born in my house. Now, remember, back then, slaves, first of all, slaves weren't treated the same as they were in America. Like, the way that we view slaves isn't how they viewed slaves. First of all, a slave was not someone that was. Slaves oftentimes were not born into slavery. It mentions they had slaves that were born into his house, but most often it's a people that were conquered. Like, it's a people group that one nation conquered, and therefore they brought their people in as slaves. Also, they didn't treat them the same way that we view slaves being treated. I'm not offering a reason why slavery is good. In any situation, slavery is not good. And that's not what the Bible's saying here, that it's good. But it was different for them back then than we understand slavery now. Also, he's not saying slavery is necessarily good. He's just saying slaves as a reason why he's making the statement, I was super rich. Because back then slaves were one of the best symbols of wealth. He then goes on to say in the rest of the verse, I also own more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me, saying, I'm wealthier than anyone else. I amassed silver and gold to myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I had a lot of gold and silver and rare treasures. I acquired male and female singers and a blank as well, the delights of a man's heart. Now that blank, we don't actually know what that word means in Hebrew. Like, there's a lot of different ideas of what it means. It's been translated as concubines or harems. It's been translated in many ways, but we don't quite know what it means. All we know is that he viewed it as another symbol of his own wealth. And then he says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And all of this my wisdom stayed with me. He says, I became literally greater than anyone. And don't worry, I was wise about it. I still kept my wisdom with me, even when I was chasing all of these pleasures. Verse 10, I deny myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. I looked at everything I wanted, absolutely everything I wanted, I got for myself. I'm testing this out, remember? I'm testing to see the validity of pleasure. I'm testing to see whether or not pleasure is good, whether or not we should pursue pleasure. So I bought everything for myself. I tried to make my life as pleasurable as possible. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. He says, because I denied myself nothing, because I bought myself whatever I wanted, I was happy to go to work. I was happy to do my work because I got what I wanted out of it. Whatever I wanted, I got because I worked. So I'm cool with working. But when I surveyed everything I had done and what I had achieved, everything was meaningless. I gained nothing. Everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Saying, at the end, I gained nothing. Yeah, I worked, and I worked, and I worked, and I worked, and I got nothing. Nothing, nothing. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than that which has already been done? And says, I thought about wisdom and madness and folly. I thought about differences between wisdom and foolishness. Because what else can someone do that's king? I mean, that's really all that the king's successor, the next king, is supposed to do, is just think about this wisdom. You know, then I came to the conclusion that wisdom is better than folly. Wisdom is better than being foolish, just like light is better than darkness. I mean, we all prefer, for the most part, to be in the light. And then he says, the wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. The wise person can see what's happening. They can see with clarity what's happening in the world, while the fool can't. But, hold on. Yeah, sure, the wise have eyes, fool walks in darkness, wisdom's better than folly, but same take overtakes all of them. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. He's saying, yeah, sure, wisdom's better than being foolish. But what do I gain? In the end, the foolish guy will die, and I, the wisest person ever, will die too. Same thing happens to both of us. There's no escaping death. There's no escaping the idea that I will die. And nothing that I worked for, nothing that I worked for will come to fruit. None of the wealth that I amassed, none of the wisdom that I accrued will really matter in the end. Because I'm going to die. Same thing for the foolish guy. And then he says, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. Days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. Remember in Ecclesiastes 1, he says, for that which has been, there will be no remembrance, and that which will be, there will be no remembrance in times past, in times after that. It's a continuation of that idea of, yeah, I'm not going to be remembered, neither was a fool. In fact, it's already happened. There were many people in the past that were wise, that we don't remember. And there were many people in the past that were foolish, that we don't remember. Ultimately, neither is remembered, no one's remembered, everyone dies, everyone is forgotten eventually. Everyone is forgotten. Everything is meaningless. Like the fool, the wise too must die. Everyone dies. Everyone, wise or foolish, it doesn't matter. And he says, I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, chasing after the wind. Because remember earlier he says, oh, so I enjoyed life and I enjoyed the toils of my labor because I experienced pleasure. But then he has this revelation of, hey, it doesn't really matter that I get this pleasure because eventually I'm going to die. It's like, so now that I know this, I hated life. And the work that I did hurts me now. It's grievous to me. It's painful for me to work now because I'm going to die, and there's nothing that can stop that. All of it is meaningless and chasing after the wind. Okay, this pleasure is meaningless, as is me hating life. All of that is meaningless. I hate all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And this is him introducing a new idea of why he hates labor. Not only am I going to die, but I also had to leave everything that I worked for, everything that I spent my entire life working for, to someone else. Who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. He's saying, I worked my entire life for stuff, and someone else is going to get it. And I don't even know if this other person is going to be wise or foolish. It's just some other guy, my son, is going to get everything. I don't know if he's wise or foolish. And for Solomon, his children were foolish. This came to pass, where the people that got his wealth were foolish. And then he says this too is meaningless. He keeps on emphasizing the fact that my labors are meaningless because I'm going to die and I don't get to take anything with me. And everything will go to someone else. And they, for all I know, they are foolish. It's almost making the assumption of, because I don't know whether or not they are wise or foolish, because they could be either. Let's take the worst case situation, make that the default. Let's assume that they're going to be foolish. Well, that's terrible. Everything's meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. I became sad and depressed because of how much work I've put in. I mean, he's at this point in his late years. He's reflecting back on his life, all the work that he put in throughout his life. He's realizing how much work he put in. And he's realizing none of it means anything. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. Someone can work for years, for their entire lives, making lots of money, and they all must leave it to someone else who hasn't worked for it. Even if that other person ends up being a wise person, they still didn't work for it. I gave them my entire life's work for free. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. He's repeating his ideas that he said earlier about how pleasure is good. Pleasure is good because it means I get to, use up my own toils. He's referencing that again here in verse 24. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. He's saying, it's good for you to party. It's good for you to eat and drink and find satisfaction. This is from God. God is allowing you to. And in the next verse, for who without God can eat or find enjoyment? All pleasure is from God. The idea that we can have pleasure is from God. Who can have pleasure apart from God? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives a task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless as chasing after the wind. He's saying God gives not only wisdom, but knowledge and happiness to someone who pleases him. But to the sinner, to that foolish person, that foolish person has to work to gather stuff and give it over to the one who pleases God. Yeah, that's the truth, but this too is meaningless to chase after the wind. Even this exchange of the foolish giving to the wise is meaningless. That doesn't mean anything either. It's still the same outcome I was talking about this entire chapter of, yeah, sure, the wise gets everything, and then he dies and has to give it to someone else who is very possible to be foolish. By the way, this part is a lot more descriptive than prescriptive, and in that it's not always true that the person who pleases God, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. To the sinner, he gives the task of gathering, storing, to give it to the one who pleases God. That's essentially implying then that the one who pleases God will get everything, the one who doesn't will get nothing. We understand that that's not true from the real world. The author here is talking both figuratively and descriptively, like, hey, this is something that oftentimes happens. It's like a proverb of him saying, yeah, this is something that can happen, that oftentimes does happen, but it's not for sure going to happen. So, what's the lesson from all of this we gained? Well, Ecclesiastes 2 is also the first time that we see at the end, the first time that we really see an unabashedly positive note in Ecclesiastes, which there are some positivities in Ecclesiastes. There's a lot of negativity, but there's quite a bit of positivity too. So he's saying, he goes through the entire thing and he's talking about why his labor is meaningless. Because people take joy in their labor, they take pride in their labor, and they see meaning in what they do. He's saying, yeah, no, there's no meaning to be had in what you do. This too is meaningless, chasing after the wind. You're going to die, and all of that stuff that you labored for is going to go to someone else. It's meaningless. It doesn't matter. But pleasure, to some extent, is meaningful. Because pleasure is from God. Who can have pleasure without God? So, that to some extent is meaningful. This is the first time that we see some kind of meaning. So, go enjoy pleasure. I'll see you guys next week. And by the way, I'm being a little bit salacious saying that. Don't then go out and get drunk, please. Enjoy pleasure to an extent. And I'll see you next week.